Welcome back to part two. When last we met, we talked about the health implications of bias and discrimination, and we talked a little bit about the historical perspective of how bias came about. That is to say, these thoughts and our feelings exist without conscious awareness, and this is called unconscious or implicit bias. And unless we bring it to the conscious, it can run stealthily through our minds and impact behavior. You know how when you're driving to work and you've done that drive many, many times, and then one day you get there at work and you're like, geez, I don't even remember driving here. It just became a habit. You sort of unconsciously got to work. It was a behavior you did without even really thinking about it. That's kind of like what we're talking about here. Only the unconscious bias when it comes to people is an age-old habit, and it's one worth breaking. Okay. So how do we stop it? I'll play your reindeer games or unicorn games. How do we stop bias and discrimination? Well, it's through the magic and power of engaging with diversity and inclusion. And that's what we're going to talk about in this next section. Okay, so let's start this section by having you consider yourself. Think about the question, who am I? And then write down at least 5 categories that describe who you are as a person. At least 5, but as many as you like. So we'll pause for 30 seconds and let's do that. Okay, so how did it go? Did you come up at least 5? Though diversity often gets reduced to a few key identifying characteristics, and these have been studied often, there are many forms of diversity that make up a person's identity, even more than you see on the slide here. The answer to the question, who am I, is not always short or straightforward or without nuance. Like, for instance, if I talk about myself, I'm an able-bodied, white, middle-class, land-owning, master's level, neurodiverse, queer, average body woman of English, French, Dutch heritage. I'm gender nonconforming, a native English-speaking resident of Canada, and I grew up in and resided in major urban spaces. And, right? And in addition to that, if you layer in cognitive diversity, so meaning all the experiences I've ever had through my life that bring a unique knowledge and way of thinking to my present moment in each moment, it's from that collective position, all of my identities and experiences, that I show up to and view each moment in life. Perhaps it's easy to see how each of us is really our own unique blend of diversity, or our own special unicorn, if you will. This is what we call our positionality, the position or place or perspective from which we experience life. Something to consider now that we're thinking about diversity and our diverse selves. Let's take a moment, if you will, and think about this question. Which aspects of your identity gave you the least difficulty in your interactions with greater society when you were growing up or even now? Pause and take a minute to just consider that. Okay, so hold on to that information for now. We'll come back to it, I promise. But back to positionality. The thing about positionality is that each aspect or slice of our identity holds with it a varying degree of social power and privilege. A social power and privilege that was given to us whether we deserved it or not, purely based on where we fell in the spectrum of our layers of identity. So there's a lot of information on this wheel that you see, but you may also see that's divided up into pie-like slices. And those slices have labels on the outside of the circle. The labels are categories, identities, much like we've been exploring at this point. And if you follow any one category color towards the center of the circle, you'll see each category is made up of some subcategories. Like, for instance, wealth in purple. Starting from the outside, you'll see the label as poor. Next, you'll see middle class. And then finally, closest to the center, you'll see rich. Something to mention here is this graphic is limited in terms of subcategorization. For instance, in wealth, there can be many other categories like lower middle class, upper middle class. But for today, we'll start with this limited view just to get the conversation rolling. But for the record, I realize this can be problematic, so it's just a starting point. I'll also add that this is a pretty westernized view of power, so it's worth keeping that in mind. Okay, so for each category, there are subcategories, and what you may have realized by this point is that the closer the subcategory is to the middle of the circle, the more social power one would likely have. For instance, a person who is rich tends to have more social power or privilege. Put another way, it's easier to have more choice or autonomy when you have more money, right? And by extension, it's easier to also have good health. For instance, you can pay for gyms, you can buy organic food, you don't have to deal with people on public transit, you can have someone clean your house or take your kids to school or care for your kids during the day so you can pursue additional goals, etc., etc. And it's easier to surround yourself or pay people who can inform you about healthy choices if need be. So if you travel around this wheel, you'll see the continuum of power in each category. For each of the categories, the impact is the same. Further out from the center, less social power or privilege, meaning life is just that much harder to navigate. And closer to the middle, it's just that much easier to navigate life or to feel good or achieve good health. Consider pausing right now and taking a detailed look at the graphic. This graphic would no doubt cause some debate about some of the categories or all of the categories. Maybe, is there actually a difference in social power, or why is there a difference in social power? There isn't really an easy way to answer that, but generally it has to do with the story of the psychological bias that I shared in the beginning and how it kind of continues to play out with humans over the years and still now to create barriers, stereotypes, and assumptions about certain groups. For instance, if you consider the different ways neurotypical and neurodiverse individuals, specifically those with ADHD, can be seen in educational settings, like traditional classroom structures often favor people who are really good at linear thinking or are able to sustain their attention and do quiet, focused behavior. Like, those expectations may disadvantage students with ADHD who may struggle with maintaining a focus on things they don't really like or interest them, who can have challenges regulating impulsivity or struggle to adhere to rigid schedules. Because of how the structure of school is set up, kids with ADHD may face challenges in meeting academic expectations and engaging in learning in the same way as their neurotypical peers. So this is a disparity, right? There is a unequal access to school because of the way that it's set up. So this can mean some students are experiencing a lot more frustration, lower self-esteem, and really lower academic success. Undoubtedly, some people listening to this can relate with how school, paradoxically, was not a great learning environment for them. And of course, the problem with that is, as our culture stands, less education typically means lower paying jobs and less money. And like we already established, having less money makes it harder to access resources and support health. It really is kind of a complex doing when we look at social power. But we know if we change the way that we set up schools and have more flexible learning environments or more individual support and a better understanding of how ADHD can be an asset, then we can help level the playing field and then empower individuals with ADHD to thrive academically and socially. As Simon Sinek says, and he's a leadership expert and best-selling author, if you haven't read anything or listened to him talk, it's really worth it. Simon Sinek says ADHD is a deficit in some contexts, but in some contexts, it's a superpower. Individuals with ADHD can have hyper focus on the things that they're passionate about. They can be super creative. They can recognize patterns and themes long before other people can. Skills like those that have led individuals like Michael Phelps, Olympic gold medal swimmer, Lisa Ling, Adam Levine, Bill Gates, Justin Timberlake, Michael Jordan, Albert Einstein, all of which have been reported to have had ADHD. And they each arguably achieved their form of greatness in life. To see neurodiverse people as lesser somehow just because of their neurodiversity is rather short-sighted. Okay, so what does this all have to do with fitness professionals? Well, I think we started to make a case for it, because remember that question I asked, which aspect of your social identity gave you the least difficulty in your interactions with greater society? It's likely whichever one or ones you mentioned is a result of being part of the power group, closer to the center of the circle. For instance, as a white woman, I rarely have to think about my whiteness. Like, it doesn't really come up in conversation. And generally, I don't really have to worry about it being a thing ever, as I kind of move through life in Ontario, Canada. But not everyone can say that. Like, I've had a Black colleague of mine once express the following when we were discussing the topic of identity. He said, "I'm quite aware of the angry Black man stereotype, so I do my best to ensure I'm overly pleasant and happy with people. It's challenging to have a bad day or even be in a low mood in public. Some people are literally scared of you because they think you're going to go flying into a rage or something. It can become totally exhausting." Those are some pretty powerful words. In contrast to my whiteness, my gender is something that's always on my mind, especially when I have to use a public restroom. I can't tell you, like, countless times I've entered washrooms during a road trip only to be met with, like, horrified looks or "you're in the wrong washroom" remarks. One time I exited a washroom at a local gym that I was visiting as I was traveling and met the eyes of a man who'd been waiting for someone inside. And he looked at me and his face kind of turned scared and he lunged towards me and then he stopped and then he redirected to the bathroom and screamed the name of the person into the washroom. I assumed at the time that maybe it was his daughter and he was worried about her, which I totally get. But I was like, get out of here before something happens. So, like, using the washroom is a basic human need. But the stress that can come with it for a person that looks like me is significantly impactful over time. Unless, of course, I'm in a space where there are many other people that look like me, where there's representation, a community. That can create a buffer for psychological stress. I have felt this in my own life, and we know that feeling part of a community has been shown in research studies to act as a buffer to mitigate the negative impact of bias and discrimination. This is where we can start to see the power and health-promoting nature of diversity and inclusion. We are each our own unique brand of unicorn, made up of diverse categories of all the ways that people can be in life. Fitness professionals are good at creating community, but if we can get even better at creating community that purposefully supports people across that spectrum, that's going to be really powerful. And a primary step towards that is continuing to explore who you are as a person. And when and where you feel safe to do so, express that. Like, living authentically can be the best community builder of all. To be the unicorn can help people find community. We've talked a bit about the concepts of diversity and expressed how social structures can be set up so not everyone has an equal chance or opportunity to access resources. But then how does inclusion fit into that?